Welcome, that's kind of loud, and thank you for coming. This is the 26th anniversary of the Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. In celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, we've been focusing on the future of wilderness, change, continuity, and conservation. Tonight, our speaker is Dustin, and he is going to be talking with us about the wilderness within. After tonight, we'll have two more lectures. The last one is April 26th, and that's going to be a lecture by M. Sanjan, who's one of the lead scientists for the Nature Conservancy. Next week, April 19th, will be Bill Borey, who's going to be talking about locking up wilderness, are we turning wilderness into zoos? And tonight, we have that speaker here, Bill Borey, and he's going to be the one to introduce Dustin, who's our featured speaker. So when we were envisioning, when we were envisioning this series, we tried to think about who could talk critically about what the critical issues would be about the future of wilderness. And it was Bill Borey who eagerly recommended that we invite Dustin. And so he's here to do the introduction. Bill is an associate professor in the College of Forestry and Conservation. He teaches about parks and recreation management. And like Dustin, more broadly, he thinks about the meaning of wilderness and our experience of that. So without further ado, here's Bill to introduce Dan.
Thanks, Nikki. And yes, I am very excited. It's indeed a very great pleasure for me to be able to introduce to you one of my academic and personal heroes. Me and my putative ideas about wilderness would not be the same today if it were not for the influence of this man. Let me start with some particulars, if you like, a bracketing of where Dr. Dustin, where his worldview has come from and some of the journeys that he's taken to bring him to where he is intellectually and personally today. He has a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science from the University of Michigan. In just a little bit, I'll explain some of the significance of that. His PhD is from the University of Minnesota, where he looked at classroom techniques for teaching controversies, wicked problems in natural resource management. He's currently the Frost Professor and the Chair of the Department in Health, PE and Recreation at Florida International University in Miami. Now, however, a very brief story of mine from 20 years ago. I was just beginning to teach at the college level. Two gentlemen, Leo McAvoy from the University of Minnesota and Dustin, published an article in the Journal of Forestry talking about no rescue wilderness. It was an idea that turned my head and my students' heads sideways. We couldn't stop talking about this concept in the classroom, in the vans to the trailhead, and while hiking through the wilderness. It was an idea that we started to wonder why it was so intriguing and what it was teaching us about wilderness, what it could and perhaps what it should be. I'm still introducing those ideas 20 years later in my classes, and it's still striking an accord. And somewhat like viral ideas that pass on, many of Dan's articles have been like that, ideas that just stay with you, resonate with you, cause you to stop and think. The limitation of the traffic light talks about the liberties that we give up for greater social goods. Reaching recreationists at different levels of moral development, how to communicate with the public as a manager, as an aficionado of wilderness, and how to get your message to resonate with the level of moral reasoning that they might be at. And the faithful execution of the public trust, fully funding the national parks through taxes. A paper that my seniors read and continue to go back to. His books, too, have influenced many. Hundreds of University of Montana students have read and enjoyed The Wilderness Within, Reflections on Leisure and Life. One student, one freshman student, said to me that it was the most influential book that they had read in their undergraduate career. Nature and the Human Spirit is a volume that Dan Dustin edited along with my boss, Dean Perry Brown of the College of Forestry and Conservation, and a Forest Service researcher, a couple of Forest Service researchers, Bev Driver, who had to testify in front of Congress about the federal government's involvement in spirituality, nature and the human spirit toward an expanded land management ethic. Stewards of access, custodians of choice, a philosophical foundation for the park and recreation profession, and tracings of an intellectual family tree, a University of Michigan story, which goes back over 30 years, looking at our forefathers and the pioneers and the heritage of which I am a distant branch of today, where it is a community of scholars, of professors, of researchers, and of students who ask to themselves, that connection with nature that humans feel, why is it important? How can we investigate it? And what are the imperatives that government has to continue to maintain that powerful human nature interaction? I commend all of the books to you. You will remember them, much as I do, which is not always something I can say about everything that I read. Likewise, Dan's talks. I can easily recall when I first heard about gardening as a subversive activity, or when I heard about Dan's daily commute across the Everglades Parkway, described as a homage and a pilgrimage, and the contributions of a non-profit administrator and lesser-known research leader, George Butler, who worked for the National Parks and Recreation Association. Please forgive me for the slightly long introduction, but it truly is with very great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Dan Dustin.
I have that sinking feeling that the introduction's going to be better than the talk. Thank you very much, Bill, for that kind and generous introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm reception this evening. Before I give the lecture that I've prepared for you, I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody here at the University of Montana for making me feel so welcome during my brief stay. I won't soon forget your hospitality. I also think it's important at the outset for me to give you a little bit better idea of who it is that's actually going to be talking to you tonight. Like many people in this room, I wear a variety of hats. As Bill indicated, I'm an academic administrator. I run a department at one of Florida's largest public universities in Miami. I'm a professor who teaches undergraduate and graduate students. I'm a social scientist who is dedicated to my own continuing education and sharing what I learn publicly through various forms of scholarship. I'm a sometimes philosopher, which means I'm as interested in the ought questions as the is questions. I'm an avid outdoor recreationist. My passions are backpacking and fly fishing. And I'm the father of two young men now who, not until they were in their early 20s, realized that it was okay to take a long walk in the mountains with their father. So I think an honest question is, which me is going to be talking to you tonight? And I think you may well conclude that the words I use are those of the social scientist or the professor or the sometimes philosopher in me, but I think it's really important that you understand that the sentiments informing those words are coming from a wilderness enthusiast and from a father who spends a lot of time brooding over the future that his sons are going to have to make their way in. So having said that, I think it's time I set out to do what I was invited here to do. On a point of land extending into a cold northern Minnesota lake, a solitary figure sits in quiet contemplation. There's a hush in the air. Distance from civilization by the remoteness of his surroundings, Sigurd Olson ponders his relationship with the larger living world. Gradually, a soft undercurrent of sound, like a wind coming from far away or something long remembered, fills the air. Olson soon recognizes the sound for what it is, the whistle of a train winding its way through his beloved North Country. He's filled with mixed emotions. On the one hand, he fondly recalls his youth, when a train whistle signaled the end of a long wilderness trek and his return to civilization and the comforts of home. On the other hand, he now finds the sound vaguely disturbing, and he asks himself whether that whistle has come to symbolize something else: the relentless advance of civilization and an end to the wilderness he knows and loves. The whistle was published in 1958 in a book called Listening Point. And at the conclusion of the essay, Olson reconciles his ambivalent feelings. Without that long, lonesome wail and the culture that produced it, many things would not be mine. Recordings of the world's finest music, books holding the philosophy, the hopes, the dreams of all mankind, a car that took me swiftly to the point whenever I felt the need. These things and countless others civilization had given me. And I must never forget that because of the wonders it had wrought, this richness now was mine. Like Sigurd Olson, I too appreciate what civilization has given me. I understand that it's the contrast between civilization and wilderness that accentuates the good things both have to offer. I understand that the existence of one helps give definition and purpose to the existence of the other. The principal difference between Sigurd Olson's reaction to the sound of that train whistle and mine can be explained, I think, by the simple fact that that long, lonesome wail and the culture that produced it is now almost 50 years farther down the track. The question I want to explore with you this evening concerns the nature of this relationship between civilization and wilderness. Specifically, I want to focus your attention on what I perceive to be the relentless advance of civilization with insufficient regard for its detrimental effects on both the physical and psychological aspects of wilderness, or what I'm going to call the wilderness without and the wilderness within. Left unchecked, I want to alert you to what I fear will be lost along the way. Then I'm going to make a case for a different kind of future, a future characterized by a civilization that exercises restraint and that consciously makes room for both kinds of wilderness. In 1975, when I was a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota, one of the first questions posed to me during my oral comprehensive examination was the following: what are the implications of recombinant DNA research for wilderness? To say that I was stunned by the question is an understatement. I didn't understand what the examiner, a futurist named Arthur Harkins, had in mind. I was at a loss for words, and I just sat there for what seemed like an interminably long and awkward time. Finally, my department chair, John Schultz, took pity on me and bailed me out by rephrasing Harkin's question for the entire committee. If we are on the verge of understanding the basic building blocks of life, what's to prevent us from putting that knowledge to good use by creating new wilderness areas whenever we want them? Fortunately, I didn't have to answer the question, because another committee member, a salty old forestry professor named Larry Merriam, jumped in and began to tangle with Harkins for quite some time about his far-fetched and unduly optimistic view of the human potential. And boy, was that just fine with me. All I wanted was for those 2 hours to pass as quickly as possible. And having survived that, I soon forgot Arthur Harkin's preposterous question, until, that is, quite recently. Events of late, and my reading of late, have reminded me how apropos it was and is to call Arthur Harkins a futurist. I am referring most directly to 2 books by Bill McKibben: The End of Nature, published in 1989, and Enough, Staying Human in an Engineered Age, published in 2003. In the first book, McKibben reasons that those places that are home to wild beasts, those unfettered places, those untrammeled places, those places largely free from the imprint of the human hand, are no more. And advancing society, or civilization, has brought us to the point where there's almost no place on planet Earth that is without human influence in one form or another. There is, in the words of Aldo Leopold, no blank spot left on the map. As disheartening as that is, I am even more disheartened by the line of thought developed in McKibben's more recent work, Enough. In it, he examines the possibility of living in a world shaped by germline genetic engineering. Germline genetic engineering, if you're not familiar with it, refers to our fast approaching capability to manipulate the genetic makeup of human beings through the alteration of sperm and egg cells. With regard to this capability, McKibben acknowledges our curiosity, our ingenuity, our inventiveness as a species, while simultaneously brooding over the ramifications of acting on them. As Wendell Berry asks in response to McKibben's book, are we ready to submit our freedom and our dearest meanings to a technological determinism imposed by the alignment of science, technology, business, and half-conscious politics? Is it possible, he asks further, for us to refuse to do something that we can do? The relentless advance of civilization, it seems, not only threatens the wilderness without, but now it threatens the wilderness within as well. In the same way we have cut back and tamed the physical wilderness through the application of science and technology, we are now on the brink of cutting back and taming the psychological wilderness inside each and every one of us. In the same way an advancing civilization has reduced the number of question marks attendant to self-willed land, it now threatens to reduce the number of question marks attendant to self-willed people. Imagine a future where basic germ cells can be altered before birth to guarantee certain traits. We might welcome such alterations if they are employed to reduce or eliminate congenital birth defects or other catastrophic human maladies. But if these alterations are employed to eliminate simple differences between and among human beings, like height and weight, and eye and hair color, and the size of one's nose, and the shape of one's teeth, or if they are employed to enhance artistic or athletic abilities, or a host of other human characteristics now comprising our diversity, then I think there is cause for alarm, and there is reason to step back and think through the implications. McKibben's fear is that if we will be able to guarantee specific attributes in our children that will give them a competitive advantage in life, the prospect will be irresistible. And once we go down that path, who would dare not come along? Who would run the risk of depriving their children of that competitive advantage when everybody around them was guaranteeing it for their children before birth through the manipulation of life's basic building blocks? McKibben then goes on to point out that if such procedures were prohibitively expensive, only the wealthy would be able to afford them, resulting in a larger and larger genetic gap between the haves and the have-nots. Furthermore, if germline genetic engineering were within reach of us all, then the relative advantage of employing it would be reduced, since everybody's prospects would be elevated similarly. Nevertheless, McKibben foresees a genetic arms race, as everybody would try to outdo everybody else. Finally, McKibben then goes on to explore a whole host of additional rippling effects that he thinks would likely flow out of such an engineered world, many of them bad. For example, how could we be confident that success in life was the result of individual effort? If an individual performed well, it could be that she or he was simply engineered to perform well. May not have much to do with the individual at all. It's not unlike our current uneasiness over the possibility that it wasn't really Mark McGwire that broke Roger Maris's home run record, but the steroids in Mark McGwire. If germline genetic engineering is perfected, it will be increasingly difficult to distinguish the individual from the engineering. McKibben worries that we might even engineer ourselves out of existence. If this kind of future comes to pass, something essential will be lost inside us. Much of the magic and the mystery will have gone out of life. The uncertainty that comes with being born into the world without knowing one's gifts, of having to discover for oneself one's gifts, and then the challenge of having to make the most of them. Engineering ourselves out of every imperfection, out of every hardship, would mean engineering ourselves out of many of life's great lessons, lessons that only can be learned by failing and then trying again. In such a world, it would not only be the blank spots on the map without that would fade into oblivion. The blank spots on the wilderness within would fade away as well. This probably looks good on television. creates the unsettling notion that I want you to struggle with me here tonight. It's not so much the lessening of the physical space we call wilderness through the relentless advance of civilization that I want you to ponder with me. It's the lessening of the opportunity to think wilderness-inspired thoughts, to consider the remaining blank spots on the map, to find sanctuary or refuge in what Wallace Stegner once called the geography of hope. Because that same advancing civilization that has cut back and tamed the physical wilderness will have cut back and tamed the psychological wilderness inside each and every one of us. It's the prospect of losing the wilderness within that unnerves me. In 1930, the historian T.J. Whipple proclaimed, "All America lies at the end of the wilderness road, and our past is not a dead past, but it still lives in us. Our forebears had civilization inside themselves, the wild outside. We now live in the civilization they created, but within us, the wilderness still lingers. What they dreamed, we live. And what they lived, we dream." We do indeed inhabit a world that has become more and more civilized as a consequence of our cutting back and taming wild nature. What our forebears dreamed, we do indeed live. But it's the latter half of that sentence, the half that says, "What our forebears lived, we dream," that haunts me. For if the state of being wild has been diminished over time, then the opportunity to experience wildness and the dreams associated with it have also been diminished. And in a society that is now 85% urbanized, one can only wonder what losing touch with wilderness will mean in the long run. What kind of future will it be if there's nothing but the sound of a train whistle? And should that day come, what will become of the wilderness inside each and every one of us? This brings me back to Wendell Berry's question. Is it possible for us to refuse to do something that we can do? Is it possible for us not to go down this road of germline genetic engineering? Or if we do go down this road, is it possible for us to limit ourselves in terms of the applications that present themselves? McKibben is skeptical. I just don't know. What I do know is that our species has made incredible technological and scientific strides over a relatively short period of time. I know further that the speed with which these advances bear fruit is exponentially fast. When the Human Genome Project was first proposed, critics said it would take 10,000 years. Its backers said they'd be done by 2010. The project was completed in 2000. It seems to me that what we have to be careful of here is sort of embracing this enthusiasm for technology without much critical consideration. For reasons I don't fully understand in our culture, we embrace technology wholeheartedly with sort of an unrestrained enthusiasm. We believe the future is full of unlimited possibilities, and we think it's our destiny as a species to continually break barriers and overcome limitations and continually try to exceed our grasp. There is a certain euphoria to this kind of thinking. There's an unrestrained enthusiasm that's so typical of futurists like Arthur Harkins. And there's also an impatience to this way of thought. You know, woe to those stick-in-the-muds who would stop us from striving to become more than we presently are, from trying to become fully human, reach our human potential, perhaps even experiencing transhumanism. To these technological enthusiasts, the best measure of our progress as a species is in the continual stream of inventions we create and in our increasing capability to change the face of the earth. It's these technological enthusiasts that are the champions of germline genetic engineering, and their motto is forward, ever forward. As McKibben reminds us, however, the rejection of limits, including the limits imposed on us by our own mortality, is not the only path that we humans can take. There are other paths, less traveled paths, paths that lead us to invent things that act not as catalysts to the movement forward of civilization, but rather that act as brakes on that advancement. This kind of path has led us, for example, to protest nuclear weapons after their creation, to employ nonviolent civil disobedience as a way to effect political change. And it has led to our invention of the concept of wilderness. Wilderness areas are crucial ecologically, McKibben says, but in many ways, their greater importance is philosophic. They are places where we, as a people, have decided to step back, where we have recognized that other species and other needs are more important than ours, that we have the capacity to exercise this kind of restraint is what makes our species unique. Our gift is that we possess self-awareness. We have the ability to step outside ourselves, observe what we're doing, both right and wrong, and then to do something about it. This is what distinguishes us from other living beings. There is ample scientific and technological progress going on in the Western industrialized world. There is quite enough engineering of the human condition. There are plenty of catalysts for change. What we need in this society is something akin to the sound of Sigurd Olson's whistle to symbolize its opposite. Not the relentless advance of civilization, but a civilization tempered by restraint. Perhaps it's the call of a loon, the howl of a timber wolf, the bugle of an elk, the wolfing of a grizzly bear. I don't know. What I do know is that there is no better place for absenting oneself from Sigurd Olson's fast approaching train than wilderness. There is no better place in this increasingly transparent society for finding privacy, for finding solitude. There is no better place for gathering one's thoughts. There is no better place for considering one's relationship to the larger living world. There is no better place for weighing one's ethical responsibility for the larger community of life. There's no better place in sum to think through the costs and benefits of an advancing civilization than through the experience of its antipode, wilderness. Roderick Nash describes wilderness as a moral resource. Its continued existence, he reasons, is testimony to our human capacity to exercise restraint. I could not agree more. I don't for a minute doubt our ability to do away with wilderness, but in so doing, I fear we would do away with ourselves. Aldo Leopold understood this when he shot a wolf and saw the fierce green fire dying in the wolf's eyes. In that instant, he knew that in killing the wolf, he had killed part of himself as well. Keeping the wilderness without alive is a way of keeping the wilderness within alive. Safeguarding wilderness is a way of safeguarding our role as citizens, plain members and citizens of a larger community of life. It is a way of acknowledging that we don't know all the answers to life's big questions, that we will never know all the answers. Wilderness preservation, in the end, as Nash concludes, is a gesture of planetary humility. 25 years ago, as Bill alluded to, Leo McAvoy and I first proposed the idea of no rescue wilderness in the Journal of Forestry. It was not grounded in machismo. Our proposal was a reaction to an article written by William Leitch in the Sierra Club Bulletin called Backpacking in 2078. Leitch envisioned a future where heavy recreational use of the public lands combined with an insurance mentality would force resource managers to employ every technological weapon in their arsenal to protect the environment from people and people from the environment. In that story, wilderness managers, not wilderness recreationists, were in charge of the experience. The prospect was abhorrent to us. So Leo and I decided to make a case for its antithesis, a wilderness where recreationists themselves would be unbridled and unfettered, a place where wilderness sojourners would be free to interact with nature on its own terms. Our no rescue wilderness proposal has not been widely embraced in the intervening years, but the need for it seems greater to me now than ever. For what William Leitch offered up as science fiction, just like that question Arthur Harkins posed to me so long ago on the implications of recombinant DNA research for wilderness, is now not so far-fetched after all. My fondest hope for each and every one of you is that you will always be able to count on wilderness as a sanctuary within you can take refuge from the relentless advance of our own tools, from everything modern and mechanical that we have created in the name of progress. And I think wilderness also has to remain that special place we visit when we feel the need to remind ourselves of our human frailty, a place to which we return again and again to gain a healthier perspective on our lives. I don't want any of you ever to have to lament the loss of the Bob Marshall Wilderness in the same way John Muir lamented the loss of Hetch Hetchy. I don't want the Bob, like Glen Canyon, to be a place fondly remembered by fewer and fewer of you over time. I want you and your children and your children's children and children throughout the ages to be able to call on the words of Robert Service, not in past tense, but in present tense, in their here and now, whenever that might be, as they gather around the campfire with their fellow mortals and reflect on their past on their present, and on their future wilderness adventures. I want them to be able always and forever to ask eagerly of one another, were you ever out in the great alone when the moon was awful clear and the icy mountains hemmed you in with a silence you most could hear, with only the howl of a timber wolf, and you camped there in the cold, while high overhead, green, yellow, and red, the north light swept in bars? Then you've a hunch what my talk has meant. Hunger, night, and the stars. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your attention. It means a lot to me. I guess if you have comments or questions or observations, I would welcome them. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask, actually, to what extent you saw a relationship between the wilderness within and the wilderness without, but it sounds like you see a fairly direct connection there. And my question then to you is how you reconcile what Robert Michael Pyle has called the extinction of experience. People don't ever experience that wilderness without. What does that do to the wilderness within?
Okay. I'm going to sort of rephrase your question as best I can here, but yes, I tried to draw a parallel between what I see as this advance of civilization that threatens the wilderness without the physical wilderness. I've also tried to draw, a parallel between that and this idea of that same advancing civilization threatening the wilderness inside each of us. And I think your question is asking me, if that wilderness without disappears somehow, what are the implications for the wilderness within? I think in my comments, what I've tried to indicate is I brood over that, and I worry about the wilderness within dying out as well. If I can talk about that in a little bit larger context, my principal fear in our country, a country that's now 85% urbanized, is that our population is losing its biological moorings. It's losing its sense of connectedness to the fundamental ground of being, which it ultimately depends on for its sustenance. If we can't somehow bring people in closer relationship with the natural world, and it just, it doesn't have to be wilderness, okay? But if we can bring people in closer contact with nature so they see, they hear, they feel that connection in fundamentally profound ways, then I have hope that this extinction of experience you're talking about could be avoided. But like you, I think, I worry about that. And I guess that's my answer, if it helps. Yes, sir.
Do you see implications of genetic engineering on wilderness without?
The question is, do I worry about the implications of genetic engineering for the wilderness without as much as I seem to be worrying about it for the wilderness within? I think my answer is yes, I worry about it, but I also sort of see that wilderness without as this incredibly complicated, sort of set of ecological relationships, and somehow I just don't know enough yet about that to sort of have an opinion formed. I know a lot more sort of about the individual human being, and that seems closer to me in terms of what might happen and what, in my judgment, might go wrong. But that was Harkin's question to me a quarter of a century ago, and that's kind of what futurists do. They sort of think way beyond the present and try to get you to think about, the possibilities. The difference, of course, between us is that Harkins would welcome that, and I would be, frightened by it. I am someone who's much more conservative. I'm not a, don't get me wrong, I'm not a bio-Luddite. I don't think I'm an alarmist. I think that we should simply slow down and consider seriously the wisdom of doing certain things we can do before we do them. In that respect, having read recently Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail and Succeed, and what he has to say about Montana's Bitterroot Valley, makes me appreciate how we can get ourselves into environmental fixes when we are sort of blinded by economic and technological short-sightedness. And it simply seems to me that under the circumstances, we should be trying our hardest to envision the long run. We should be trying to err on the side of conservation when we don't fully understand the short or long-term consequences of our actions. And we should be doing the best job we can of safeguarding future options. And that just seems prudent to me. But again, what I am sort of conflicted over is living in a society that seems to have such unbridled enthusiasm for technology. If we can do it, why worry? I've done some reading about the Manhattan Project in the Second World War and some of the scientists who were responsible for creating, the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And one of the here's the issue. While we are moving very quickly technologically and scientifically, there's a significant lag time between understanding what we can do in that regard and then understanding what we ought to be doing ethically. And that's what these scientists were brooding about. It's sort of like we embrace the technology without really thinking about, the ethical implications of it. And I think that demands sort of a slower, deliberative kind of a process. That's all. Yes, sir.
I was just listening to you talk about the Manhattan Project and limitations and things like that. I know a lot of the Manhattan scientists and a lot of the DDT scientists were very, very worried about what this was going to be put to use for. And that it was the military and political concerns overriding any scientific concerns about the longevity. How do you see in this world that's so rewarding of the go growth, how do you see us suddenly becoming and turning that all around, becoming very conservative and thinking about what we're doing before we actually go out and do it?
Well, the question is in a culture that's very enamored with technology and tends to interpret progress in terms of advancements in technology and scientific breakthroughs and the like, how on earth can we ever get the culture as a whole to slow down, maybe think things through a little bit more deliberatively before we adopt and adjust? I think it's a very difficult thing, but I think the most important thing I could say is that you need a citizenry of enlightened people who are willing to educate themselves about these issues and then become involved actively in trying to work for certain outcomes. I think that in the United States, we've become so specialized in a variety of ways, and if something's going on out there that's not our specialty, we seem inclined to allow the experts, to do it. And I think that's a bad way for a democracy to sort of function. So the kind of change that would interest me demands an enlightened citizenry. It demands an educated citizenry. It demands, people going to universities like the University of Montana, not just to get a job when they get through, but to educate themselves in a broad, general way so that they can be better participants in a participatory democracy. So I don't, your question's a very big one, and I don't think there's an easy answer to it. But it's also wrapped up in issues like measuring success in life by income or items you purchase, and sort of the whole sort of market, culture we live in, and laissez-faire capitalism, and measuring how you're doing in life by the number of possessions you have, and that sort of stuff. And when I first started out in higher education, I wanted to change the world. Now I'd be happy if I could just change myself. So I think that the challenge that you're sort of posing here, if you want to make a difference in a larger sense, is how do you do that? And I think you do it by becoming a model through the way you conduct your own life, and other people hopefully will emulate that, and before long maybe something significant happens. There's another question embedded in your question, I think, which has to do with the responsibility scientists have for the work they create. And I've been involved in a debate for a long time with a variety of people over that issue. I mean, I know a lot of scientists who think my obligation is to deliver information to policymakers, and it's up to the policymakers to decide if they're going to use that information or not. And so the use that's made of the results, I find, is not really my business. And I'm a little bit personally uncomfortable with that. And part of the reason I'm uncomfortable with it is, as I said at the outset, I wear lots of hats. And I'm not just a social scientist, right? I'm also someone who is interested in the ought questions, and I'm a father and all of that. So there are lots of different parts of me that want to, have something to say about the role of science and sort of the use that scientific information is put to. Yes, sir.
When humans incorporate recreational tools in their attempt to be in the wilderness without, do you maybe feel that taints what the true sense of what wilderness without is?
Well, yes. I'm happy to have mountain bikes in wilderness. I just want people to carry them on their back, But I alluded to that when I said I think wilderness ought to be a place to find sanctuary from our own tools. My answer is yes. I mean, I'll tell you what. A few years ago, I'll tell you how stupid I am. About a dozen years ago, I ran 100 miles through the Sierra Nevada. And they do that sort of thing in California. They have these long runs and everything. And I trained 2 years for it, and I thought, really, this is an interesting thing, Dan. And it did not turn out to be a dance with wilderness. I mean, it was ominous, it was dark psychologically, it was a bad, bad experience. And I realized that, my feeling was, Dan, you shouldn't be running through wilderness. You shouldn't be jogging through wilderness. It's okay to walk through wilderness, but the best way to probably experience it is sort of on my belly or something. So anything that buffers us, from nature, I'm not a fan of. And that's what Joseph Sachs wrote about in Mountains Without Handrails. He sort of said that things that buffer us and cushion us from that direct interaction with nature, something that we probably shouldn't do. And I'm kind of like that. So, but I still don't own a cell phone, you see. And I actually have the next issue of The Wilderness Within is going to contain an essay called "Confessions of a Technological Resistance Fighter," and so there's that, part of me as well. But and even we're so it's not just tools, but if you're a backpacker, there's so much stuff you can get in backpacking. And my kids had these water filters when they backpack, and they just hated me because I was popping these little tablets, that made the water taste like iodine. And other people they saw had these water filtration systems, and they thought that was cool and everything. you know, and I see now they've come out with tablets to take away the iodine taste, so you put 2 tablets in. And I just prefer that if I have to, you know, use such tablets to avoid giardia and things, because it's lighter. And you know, I'm always trying to lighten the load when I backpack, and the more I figure I can carry in my head, you know, the better it is. I even once tried to emulate John Muir, who went out on a trip with nothing but nuts and bouillon cubes or something. And I did that. I went on a week-long backpacking trip with nuts and bouillon cubes. And boy, that was a tough trip. So, but I like the theme of when you get, you know, not all recreation settings, but in the context of wilderness, I like the theme of having it as much as possible be you and nature without a lot of noise. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
First of all, I appreciate how deeply you think about these things, and thank you.
Thank you.
You just talked about running 100 miles through wilderness, and I wonder if you would address the issues of competition, which are what drive our technology and everything seems to be revolving around competition, or making money, and the race to have the best technology.
Yeah. The question here is about competition in our culture and how to approach it. Again, it's a very large question, right? I'm a lot more interested in cooperation than competition. I remember I'm a fan of Wallace Stegner, and he used to write about the myth of the American West, where the idea is that there was this rugged individualism that sort of explained the American West as depicted on television in a variety of cowboy movies and so on and so forth. And in fact, he said it was cooperation, basically, between and among people that allowed the West to, you know, to be settled. You're talking about something that's ingrained in our culture. You're talking. There's great stories here I can get into, but you know, you're especially talking about the way that boys are brought up to be men. You know, to sort of see the world out there as dog eat dog and all of that. And I don't find that a particularly useful sort of paradigm. And again, all I can do is in my own sphere of influence try to do something else. I have a great story about sort of moral development issues. I don't know if you're a student of moral development, but there used to be a guy at Harvard named Lawrence Kohlberg who had a very popular theory of moral development, and you go through all these stages if you were fully evolved in a moral way, and eventually you became your own person. You had to live up to your own convictions. You'd stand against the world if need be to defend your own principles, and so it kind of leads to autonomy, and it's kind of the way boys are brought up. And I once did Bill referred to it. I once did a paper about this and got a lot of positive feedback about that paper, and then a couple of my best friends came to me who happened to be women and said, you know, Lawrence Kohlberg did all of his work with men, and you know, his hypothetical stuff. And did you know there's another person at Harvard named Carol Gilligan who studied moral development in women? And did you know that there's a difference in terms of how women are acculturated into their moral reasoning and men? And did you know that for women, as they get farther and farther along in their moral development, there's a context of caring that sort of permeates the way they you know, make decisions in should and should not situations. And so for me, at first it was like, oh, damn, you know, it's back to the drawing board. And my quick response was something like, but you know, most damaged outdoor recreation environments are done by teenage males in groups. Therefore, you know. But what happened when I went back and studied Gilligan, I said, you know, I think this is a better way to bring up people. And so at the time I had 2 little boys. And so I said to myself, you know, do you dare do this to these boys? And I did, and we did. And what I have now are 2 adult boys who are, in a certain sense, soft. You know, they are empathetic. And Perry says, I don't buy it for a minute. My oldest son's a corporate attorney in Chicago, but you know, they're empathetic and they're caring people. And I think if there's competition going on inside my oldest son's head, it's with himself, trying to stretch himself. But I don't sort of see that, between him and others. I come from an interesting family. My dad was a Kohlbergian high school principal. My mother was a Gilligan-like kindergarten teacher. And my dad was a school principal in Michigan. He once got a phone call from a superintendent of schools in Kansas saying, "Hey, I've got this teacher in the office interviewing for a job." A teacher who had not taken a business day from my dad's school. So the teacher not only got a bad recommendation from my father, when the teacher got back, my father fired him. I mean, he's a Kohlbergian guy, it's right and wrong, and my dad was living up to his worldview, My mother never would have done that. She'd have brought that teacher in, said how disappointed she was in that teacher. If that teacher couldn't afford to take a business day, perhaps they could have talked. There'd have been some sort of, I'm disappointed in you. But God, my mom wouldn't have fired the teacher, But my dad didn't have any problem firing the teacher. So, and I'm not saying here that my dad was a bad person. I'm saying that he'd have been acculturated into this sort of Kohlbergian way of doing things. And I think I've gone a little afar from your question, but it is tied sort of to competition when you think about that. So anyway, yes, I'm sorry.
Do you feel like you have any moral obligation towards science, towards like the study of any, like a heart valve study or something that you would that would help save a life? Like, do you feel like you have any obligation or any sort of desire to continue that study, even though it is in the forward motion?
Yeah, again, I'm not against technology per se. What I'm giving you tonight is a cautionary kind of perspective, and in the same way that there are people who sort of automatically embrace a new technology, they're the first one to get the gadget or whatever. I'm the one who's always skeptical. It's like, okay, what's the downside here? And that's all I'm saying. But I mean, if advances in technology can help save lives, that kind of thing you're talking about, I don't have any particular objection to that. I have some interesting objections to issues like the Terry Schiavo case in Florida we just dealt with, in terms of using technology to keep someone alive who really has no sort of conscious life or anything. That seems to me like a waste of time. Yes?
In the prior presentations, they spoke of our society's embracing technology and technology use as a waste of time to keep their share of life. My question to you is, do you feel religion has a role to play in slowing down this trend? And if so, what that role may be?
Okay, so the question is, how does religion play into all of this? Once again, it's a very large question, okay? I think, the only honest answer is it depends on how you interpret what your religion is teaching you, For example, if you read Genesis and you look at the word dominion, and you really sort of take the notion literally that humankind has dominion over the earth, and that suggests to you that nature only has instrumental value, that nature is nothing more than a storehouse of raw materials that derives value when we extract them for our use. If that's your interpretation of Genesis, then I would say religion could be a very bad thing. Okay, so it kind of depends. I used to know that when I was at San Diego State, I met this minister in La Jolla, California, And her particular sermon suggested to everyone in La Jolla that your prosperity is God's way of saying you're really a good person. And boy, did they love to hear that in La Jolla, California. And then interestingly enough, she took a trip to India, spent some time in India, came back 6 months later and said, I got it wrong. I don't know how to answer your question other than to say it depends. I think religion can be used or interpreted in ways that may be beneficial to us, but it's also possible religion could be used in ways that aren't so beneficial. I mean, there's some aspects of... I just married a Roman Catholic, and the Catholic Church got a lot of money in the United States. No, not as much as they used to have, but I mean, it's kind of a big business, and I know the Mormon Church has a lot of money, and so this stuff gets very complicated. I'd say the same thing to you. It's all about you and your religion and how you interpret your responsibility based on that religious perspective. But
well, again, I was more along the lines of leaders of certain religious organizations. Should they play a more active role in separating or facilitating discussion about the fact of science advancing so fast, that lab that you were talking about, people not going to keep up with science versus religion?
Well, again, my answer, I don't know that religious leaders per se, ought to be the ones, to take the lead on any of this. I would say any participant, any citizen in our democracy who has strong feelings about, how they want their future to unfold, and goes to the effort to educate themselves about the issues, ought to be the person that steps up in whatever sphere they can have an influence in. And that's the way things get done. Things get done locally, and then if they're meaningful, it sort of grows, and then you've got something large. And I think it was Garrett Hardin who said you should never globalize a problem that can be dealt with locally. I think what's really difficult in all of this for all of us is these problems are so large. We feel so small, and how can we make a difference? And if everybody else is doing something contrary to what I believe in, how can I screw up the courage to follow my own convictions? And my answer is you got to get over it. You've got to do what I try to do now increasingly, which is to change my own life in a way that's meaningful, and hopefully, if other people emulate what I'm doing, so be it. But if they don't, I have to be happy that I've changed me. I don't want to look outside for a lot of approval, right? Anyway, I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, how do you, as a naturalist, I guess, a person who takes the nuts and the broth cubes out into the forest, how do you interpret to a society that loves to get the gadget, the first gadget, and be the first person with all these toys to go out into the wilderness? How do you, as a person just with the nuts, how do you, I guess?
I shouldn't have used that example of. That was me trying something and failing miserably. You see.
Well, I mean, just how do you interpret that to a society that loves the technology?
Well, let me. The question is sort of how do you push this line of thought to a culture that isn't, like you, Dan, right? And what I'm going to talk about now is a little bit beyond the context of wilderness, but as I told Dr. Borey's class this morning, standing before you is someone who is a social engineer, right? I want to try to develop a spectrum of recreation opportunities that provide people with practice, in a sense, that sort of moves them toward a certain kind of being. And actually my sort of theme is promoting recreation as self-sufficiency, okay? I want to have people who are highly skilled in what they're doing for recreation, have good hard skills. I want people to have, to be advanced in their moral reasoning, I want them to have good soft skills, good judgmental skills. I want to make sure there's a gradation of opportunities for them so that whatever skill level they're at, they'll find a challenge to match their skill. And for some of you in the room, you should begin to be thinking about Mike Csikszentmihalyi. This is what sort of the scheme he sets up for studying the nature of human enjoyment. And then finally, as people get better and better skilled and are farther and far along in their moral reasoning, and I've created these challenges for them, I want to give them freedom to be accountable and responsible for themselves, so that ultimately I want to turn them over to themselves. Okay, what I want is a society full of self-sufficient human beings. That doesn't mean human beings who don't care about other people, but it means a society full of people who feel good about themselves and their own capability and their own efficacy. And I think those are the best people you want around if you need help, right? And I also want that same sort of self-sufficiency, not just in a physical sense, but an intellectual sense, because those are the kinds of people I want to make decisions about who should hold public office, right? Who should lead the country, those sorts of things. I'm not, and this goes back to, nobody asked this question, with a religious question. I don't look for political leadership. I don't have much faith in politics. I have a lot of faith in individual citizens doing what I just described and then making a difference in their sphere of influence. And then if enough people are like that, all of a sudden the politicians will be going that way, right? But I don't expect enlightened leadership from politicians. I don't know if that's blasphemy, but well, Montanans should like that. I mean, right? Yes.
How do you translate some of these observations and issues internationally to cultures outside the U.S.?
The question is, how does all this apply internationally? Well, the last stuff I just talked about, it applies, in my judgment, all over the place. I mean, I want a planet full of people who are self-sufficient. If you're asking me about wilderness and all of this, I mean, most of my experience has been in the United States. And when I think about wilderness, I usually think about it in relationship to our country. I know that there are lots of other issues that command other people's attention in other parts of the world that are not, wilderness related. I know that, again, I've tried to make the point, and I think this is Rod Nash's point, that wilderness is a construct, in a sense, we've invented, right, in this culture. I realize that lots of cultures don't make this distinction, and that wilderness is not something separate and out there, and that they see it all very differently. So I think that my guess is much of what I've been talking about here is specific probably to the United States, and much of my brooding is about the Western industrialized world. So I don't have a great answer for you. Did you? Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
I have a question about your last statement about politics.
Right.
I have tons of questions, but I guess first of all, it kind of threw me because I didn't expect it from you after the lecture that you just gave. But what would your vision be then? I mean, if we, for some sort of governance structure, I mean, would it be completely devolved down to the local level? And then I guess my question would be to you then, if you say that would be the structure for governing, how do you deal with the fact that if the wilderness had been left to the Westerners historically, there wouldn't be a heck of a lot of it left?
Right. So your question is, since I've dissed government and politics, right? What am I after? I mean, I'm not. My point has been, again, that ideally, especially in a participatory democracy, not a representative democracy, but a participatory democracy, I want a culture full of people who are enlightened and who are involved and who are active, okay? And not leaving important community decisions up to a few experts, okay? And, so I'm not talking about a future, I'm not a libertarian, I'm not, an anarchist or anything. I think government plays an important function. All I'm saying is I don't really look to government for leadership in this area. It's kind of like, it's the reason I don't look to business. I mean, politicians are worried about getting elected as soon as they've been elected. They're worried about getting reelected. Let me give you an interesting example. I just did a sort of a study of the 20th century American presidents' use of the Antiquities Act. And lo and behold, found that it doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican, you know, in their first term of office or while they're concerned about being reelected, they don't do a lot for the environment. But when they're ready to leave office and want to leave a legacy, then all of a sudden, you know, they do all these wonderful things for the environment. So I guess I like politicians who are lame duck and don't have to worry about being reelected and now can maybe do something for the good of the order and not have to worry so much about which part of their constituency is going to take offense or, you know, be problematic. Let me tell you one other. You may not know this. In my part of the world, there was a woman named Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and she moved to Miami in 1915 when her dad became the editor of the Miami Herald. And Marjorie Stoneman Douglas took an interest in the Everglades. And she eventually, in 1947, wrote a book called The Everglades River of Grass. Okay? She and a man named Coe were instrumental in getting Everglades National Park created. I met her when I moved to Miami 8 years ago. She was 107 years old. She had been blind for almost 30 years. She was still involved environmentally, and she was an activist and spunky. And here's a story of one person, one woman, who, you know, if we could saint people for their environmental work, she will be sainted one of these days. And she did it, in a sense, all by herself. So, I mean, this little bitty woman in South Florida changed the world. One person. You know, she never held political office. She just was tenacious. She had a purpose. She had a cause she believed in. And she just was an extraordinary human being. And I'd encourage you, if any of you want to, you know, to sort of study someone and who you might want to be like someday, it would be a woman like Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, I think. Yes?
I think this will be a really easy question for you to answer. The poem that you quoted at the end, who was the author of that?
It's Robert Service. And those of you, I suppose I should apologize. The question was this last poem. It's from the shooting of Dan McGrew. And actually, well, shoot, I shouldn't say this now, but when it's just a stanza out of the poem. Were you ever out in the great alone when the moon was awful clear and the icy mountains hemmed you into the silence you most could hear? With only the howl of a timber wolf and you camped there in the cold. But then it goes on, and you camped there in the cold, blah, 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 clean mad for the muck called go. I decided, no, you don't want that. And so then I went to the, you know, I love Robert Service and the shooting of Dan McGrew and the cremation of Sam McGee. He's just a lot of fun, especially around a campfire. So if you're not familiar with him, you would enjoy him. If some of you are not familiar with Sigurd Olson, you know, in my mind, perhaps the 20th century's most, I want to say, beautiful writing about the environment. His books are like poetry. It's prose, but it's like poetry. He was a very gentle soul, and wrote 9-10 books. And mostly about the North Country, but not entirely all about the North Country. Wrote some about Alaska, but extraordinary writer. So if you're interested in the environment and you haven't read Sigurd Olson, he's a good read for you. And if you don't know Wendell Berry, he's a very good read for you. An organic farmer in Kentucky who thinks very deeply about our relationship with nature. And not that you have to agree with him, but he writes beautifully, and he gives you food for thought. And so he's a good person. And I think that's what McKibben's role is. McKibben's role is to get us to stop and think and brood, and that's why I find what he writes so resonating, at least with me. Yes, Miss. Sure.
Where's your favorite wilderness area and what are the reasons why?
My favorite wilderness area is the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana. And the reason, well, you would appreciate this story. I grew up in Michigan, in a suburb of Detroit. And it turns out that my parents had some neighbors that they liked a lot who moved from Michigan to Moses Lake, Washington. And these neighbors said, well, why don't we get together for a vacation together? And the place that they brought us to was on the edge of the Bob Marshall. It's in the Benchmark area. It was called the Bruckert Ranch. I'm talking 1950s now, and I'm like 8 years old. And it cost our family $25 a week to rent a cabin. And the Bruckert Ranch was really an elk hunting camp, but in the summer, to make ends meet, they rented cabins. And if we wanted to rent a horse to go to Pretty Prairie or someplace in the Bob, it was $3 a day. There was no electricity, there was no running water, there was no wood-burning stove, light by kerosene lamp, an outhouse. You kept your perishable food in a garbage can in a stream to be cold. But what happened, my parents took me there every other summer while I was growing up. And every year we'd come back and they would make an improvement. And I didn't like that, right? And then, so I went after my 5th grade, 7th grade, 9th grade, 11th grade, those trips. Happiest days of my life. I then went back in 1966 with a college roommate and found that a place where I had fished was now a Forest Service airstrip. Literally, the stream that I fished in as a kid was now a Forest Service airstrip. And that's why I'm standing here today. So when I was a kid, something that happened to me so significantly when I was growing up and then watching something change is what accounts for my presence here. I'd been in the service in Europe and got disillusioned with people and said, gee, what matters to you, Dan? And it was saving the Bob Marshall Wilderness. So I'm a big fan of the Bob. I'm also a big fan of California, Sierra Nevada. I've hiked the length and width of the Sierra Nevada and love it. And I like the canyon country in Utah and the Grand Canyon. So there are lots of places I like. But the Bob will always be my favorite place because it was where everything sort of happened for me intellectually and emotionally, I guess.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, my pleasure.